I'm a human. And if you're watching this, there's a very good chance that you are also a human. And there's two major things that we all generally know about humans. The first thing is we are inherently curious creatures, always poking our noses into things, whether or not we should. Curiosity like a cat, as we like to say. And the second big thing about a lot of humans is that we make mistakes. Make them all the time, right? It is very human to err. And even the greats, trained their whole lives, will every once in a while still choke at the final buzzer of the big game. Now, when you take a little human curiosity and a little bit of human error and mix it up with medical marijuana, you run into things like overconsumption and overdosing. Situations like this might just be somebody who miscalculates and takes too much, or maybe grabs the wrong item they thought was something different. And now they run into an uncomfortable state of maybe racing paranoia, or something like anxiety, increased fear, or at the very worst, areas of toxic consumption or toxicity. Now, this is where the body is so overwhelmed from the chemistry that you might end up passing out or even puking sometimes. Now, no matter how beneficial medical marijuana can be, anyone who goes through one of these episodes of overconsumption, it can really shake even the strongest minds of us to its very core. And I'm sure there's a lot of interested parties out there who may have tried cannabis before, run into one of these, and are very shy to come back. So with that in mind, today, we're going to tackle this and figure it out and ask, well, what are some of the most common causes of overconsumption or overdosing? Is there anything that you can do to help yourself out in a moment where you realize things are becoming too intense and you may have consumed too much? And lastly, how can somebody strategize as a patient to avoid stepping over the line of a proper dose? Well, my name is Scott Goddard. This is the Daily Dose provided by Terravita, and today, Tim, I guess we're gonna get sober? Well, everybody, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me, and please consider subscribing to the channel if you like topics like this, because I think that it's very important and it's very worth it to avoid some of those horror stories you may have heard. Nobody wants a possibly great situation turn into a definite detrimental outcome. Although it's not always the worst, overconsumption is a serious thing. Medical cannabis, like the things behind me, all contain chemical compounds which can interact with our body in a very innate way. And these interactions will change how our bodies function. Sometimes it can change the access to thinking that we have. And so we know that it's very important to respect the depth of possible effects. Now, in some extreme circumstances, some folks have maybe consumed enough cannabis to even feel like they might die because it's very, very reactive in a moment. But thankfully, cannabis consumption cannot cause a fatal overdose in the way that alcohol or things like heroin can. Thankfully, there are no receptors in the brainstem, that core part of our neurological system, where functions like the heartbeat and breathing are nestled. But that doesn't mean that we should take liberty. It is still worth avoiding unsafe states. And so we find, what causes these states the most? What do people run into that tempts the most risk? Well, it's kind of like two or three things that do it. One, we find when folks change maybe their formulation. So say you are a vape user and you go from something like a CO2 vape to a liquid live vaporizer. Well, if you change your formulations have different ingredients, and so you might have more intense reactions in the liquid live category. There's a lot more monoterpenes in there, or you might have a more intense, faster acting sort of reaction in a distillate formation. Each formula kind of has its own sort of strengths and weaknesses and ways that it can tune your experience. Now, although you might just be inhaling it, sometimes folks will go from something like flower to something in a cartridge. And this is actually one of those areas we find a lot of folks kind of have to sort of reset their thinking. 3.5 grams, what is otherwise known commonly as an eighth of an ounce of medical marijuana, has a certain potency to it. And they say that if you extract from 3.5 grams, you get just a bit more usually than a half of a gram. Now, this is one reason why $50 is kind of the average price for a cartridge, and $50 is sort of one of those pivotal prices for an eighth. They're kind of saying the amount of work is the same, and the amount of potency is comparable. I wouldn't say exactly the same, but in the same realm. But that also means now that I have 7 times the amount in volume than I have here in concentrate. So each breath, we often say, might be between 2 and 5 times the potency per dose breath for flower. And so if anybody switches between even just inhalable products, from flower to vapes, from vapes to concentrates, you can still run into this sort of amplification of the effects, and it's something worth being able to think about before you jump in with both feet. Now, although formulation is one thing if you're using the same route, the second area where people often overconsume is in changing the route of administration. Now, that is kind of a fancy way to say changing the way you put it in your body. Inhalables use the lungs, right? Vape carts, concentrates, flower, all use the lungs. And so there's a common way we can predict dosing and effects to an extent. However, maybe now somebody told you about something like a tincture or a capsule, and you're switching from the lungs to the stomach. That is a much different process, a lot more going on in the stomach, a lot different mechanisms being involved. And so whenever people switch between those, we often find that edibles tempt people into a state where overconsumption is possible. There's actually a couple things about when you take in edibles that really make it specifically interesting. And one of the big ones as to why edibles often are the area where people, if they haven't, first run into the sort of overdosing feeling or when they take too much, is because edibles can take a very long time to kick in. They're also kind of hard to dose, right? You might know how much you inhale in a session, but it's kind of hard to relate that to how much to actually put down the gullet. And so being hard to dose between a tincture, a measured dose in a capsule, and things like RSO, Rick Simpson oil, which are very intense, and we often say a quarter of a rice grain is enough to start. A lot of folks are like, a quarter of a rice grain? Scott, I'm used to taking the largest bud in the container, and now we're literally taking less than this tip of a pen. Well, yeah, it's very hard for the mind to kind of believe that these things are similar, and that's one reason why we always say you sort of have to reset your thinking if you're going to change the route of administration or the formula, because each one changes the volume that you're going to be used to and the volume that you might think you need. Now, although the size of the dose you're taking out of the bottle might be one part of it, the way you execute is another big one. Sometimes you might be mucking up the math when you're doing batch cooking. Maybe you just carried the 1 to the wrong spot, or the decimal point didn't move with the 0. You might have executed the recipe unevenly, right? And this is classic Scott right there. You try to make some brownies. You didn't quite mix it the right way, and now you got hot spots where one corner is very, very potent, and maybe this other corner is kind of dull with little to no potency in it. So that's another area where you have to be careful, because any process is going to change the outcome a little bit. Or, just like with flower to vapes, you could go from capsules to RSO, or from capsules to RSO capsules. Once again, the formula changes, the way it interacts with us changes, and what we're really just saying is it's always worth slowing it down a little bit. Ask your bud tender, use online resources, come to an education center event, and we can try to always help you understand the best way to predict the outcome of what you're doing. But there is one other key, one other detail to edibles, really the third piece of this that really makes them such a focal part of this conversation. And that is what happens once you absorb it. You see, getting it into your belly is the first challenge. Getting it to digest is the second. But your liver does a very special thing. It kind of supercharges the situation. So you may take in, say, a 5 milligram dose. Something we say is probably a good starting dose for a tolerant user. 2.5 to 5 milligrams is kind of the starting range for most. And we take in THC, what is called delta 9 THC. And it gets into your body, but once your liver takes care of it, it can actually convert it into a metabolite which is called 11-hydroxy THC. And this changeover, this little conversion, it's sort of like upping the octane it's actually sometimes 4 to 5 times more psychoactive than delta-9 CHC, which means when you take in an edible, not only is it potentially the dose which changes, but the outcome of the dose could be 4 to 5 times more potent. So there I am taking let's say a 5 milligram measured dose, and it could actually give me effects that might be closer to 10 or even 20 milligrams. Now that's actually probably encouraging for some because maybe you're not quite getting your relief, and that might actually show you that edibles might be the new thing for you. But for some out there, this is also a great caution to let you know that just because you can go through an eighth pretty quickly or a vape card a day, edibles are just a completely different thing, and you're going to have to retune your whole process for that route of administration. So, all in all, what's really telling you is to be safe and be patient and do your research. Take your time. And that leads us to question 2. Is there anything that we can do if you catch yourself in a moment where you feel you have taken too much, right? Feel that feeling in your fingertips. It's almost like nervousness, like you're giving a speech that you didn't know about and you have no clothes on, like that bad dream, right? You can feel that cortisol release. So what is it that you can do in a moment if you feel like it's going bad? Well, biologically, much like alcohol, it is hard, dare I say sometimes near impossible, to actually eliminate a chemical that has been absorbed into the body. Once you put it in your body, it's very, very hard to remove all of it, and even a little bit of it sometimes. So we're not necessarily thinking of like tearing it out of the body. You might have had a friend once who drank too much, right? And maybe they're like, oh, you drank too much, man, you should eat something. You should drink something, drink some water, non-alcoholic beverages, assumably. That way you can hopefully help yourself sober up. But alcohol content, right? Alcohol's in the bloodstream. So in those moments, really, you're not removing alcohol from the blood by eating a hot dog or a hamburger. You're actually trying to affect other parts of the body, transporting it around your body, absorbing it in, and it getting to the active sites. So if we can slow down these other secondary processes, we might be able to buy ourselves some time and some safer headspace. So when we think about what we can do, it's kind of like more distracting the body and making it change its priority in a lot of areas. And so some basic things people might say, as we said, eat something. It slows down your metabolism, which can slow down your body, just general absorption in every system. It's one reason why if you eat before bed, they say you might not sleep as well, because your body sort of switches gears to whatever it's doing next. And this is actually something that some of you who may have consumed before breakfast may have noticed. Consumption on an empty stomach with no food on you, I would say is noticeably different than consumption on a full belly. Just enough to notice, maybe just enough to strategize with. So eating's a good way. You might be able to sleep it off. If you're in an environment where sleep is possible or nap, sometimes it makes you tired anyway, so just taking a long nap is good. But pro tip, hydrate. Definitely hydrate. Not only is dry mouth, or what some folks in the streets call cotton mouth, something that we want to avoid, but also when you sleep that long, THC can kind of dehydrate you a little bit as your body's doing its healing. So it's always good to prep with some extra water so you don't wake up too dry. And if you have a friend around, do something familiar, something comfortable, something that you like. That might be like playing a game that's easy, watching a familiar movie or a show, eating some food that you like. Let it ride out in a controlled environment. This are all sort of behavioral ways that we can try to help ourselves when we're starting to get into an unsafe sort of headspace. But chemically, we have really only 2 things that are possible. And one of them is actually clearly in front of us right now. Our good friend CBD. CBD is sold in the dispensaries, but I can tell you if you ever buy it from us, it's always going to have enough THC to count as a controlled substance. The more CBD you can get, the better. And technically, you want to get it isolated because we have 1-to-1s and 4-to-1s. So the 4-to-1 will have a little bit more CBD concentration. It might be a product that's going to help us out with this little hack that we have ahead of us. Because what happens when you take in CBD, it's sort of like musical chairs, right? Now, THC and CBD, they are sort of siblings. Sometimes they really get along. They work as a team. But in certain instances, like in overconsumption, they can actually compete a little bit. And what that means is you might have a spot in your body where THC is trying to get to, and on its own, it just gets there every time, and it creates that classic effect you might be looking for. But now I took in too much. Now it's binding all the time, and the effect's getting too intense. So I kind of want to turn off that switch, right? I want to kind of block the musical chair. I don't want THC to sit in it the whole time. So I bring CBD enters into the game. And now THC and CBD kind of share the spot. Sometimes CBD takes it, sometimes THC takes it. And for the user, what that means is instead of THC just overwhelming you, now we're kind of applying the brakes. Now it has to share. And that means it's not going to have as much for itself. That can help start gaining ground on the experience and making it feel like you haven't lost complete hold on your senses. So CBD can do that. And as I said, in the dispensary, you're going to want to look for like 4-to-1, 10-to-1 products. Some tinctures go that way. Some capsules go that way. Those will help because you really want to add CBD to an area where THC is already kind of too primary. But there is a second thing. Because again, it might be rare for us to have isolated CBD from the open market in the house just sitting by itself. So if you're in the dispensary, some CBD flower or other CBD ratio products will help. But there's one other hack. It's kind of the real sly one. And it concerns this bottle that's been sitting up here of a terpene, one of the essential oils of the plant, which is called beta-caryophyllene. Some people say caryophyllene. By other name is a smelly little chemical, and it's actually one of the primary smells of cannabis. I got a bottle of it here. It kind of comes off like perfume, and to me it really smells a little bit like cloves plus cinnamon a little bit. But funny enough, it actually performs very similar jobs to CBD. Not the same, but similar. And to really check out how that works, we're going to take a walk over to a lovely wall we have in this room. So follow me real quickly if you may. All right, so over here we have the cannabinoid wall. We have cannabinoid receptor 1 and cannabinoid receptor 2 with some information about them. And this is something we have in our education center, so it's always available. If you ever come to a class, you'll see it. But up here, you can see what I was talking about earlier. CBD and THC sort of fight for the same musical chair, CB1, our first cannabinoid receptor. And in this way, CBD can sort of knock it away and prevent you from getting too much of an intensity from THC operating alone. Then, at this blue dot, what is CB2? The second cannabinoid receptor, we can see CBD binds there, but indirectly. And in that way, it actually manages the site. It can help create more level effects as opposed to the peaks and valleys. And this is also where beta-caryophyllene comes in, as it is also able to interact directly at the receptor. It's very unique in that way. It binds to CB2 and actually mimics the effects of CBD. So in this way, beta-caryophyllene and CBD can both create similar ways of sort of dampening the effects of THC at the receptor level, and that's why we know it works. And to finish off, to see where we find it, let's head back to the desk and see. And now that we can see from our little journey over to the wall how CBD and beta-caryophyllene sort of create mimicry and effects, not the same but similar, as we like to say. Now we got to think where to find it, because not everybody's going to go and foot the bill for some isolated terpenes, as we have here on the table. So we always want to look for easy remedies. And one of the areas you can find beta-caryophyllene at home is actually in the rind of a black peppercorn. So I have here a little jar of black peppercorns that I nabbed at the store this morning. I think it was like $6 or $8, but you really want to go for the whole peppercorns because we're trying to get this terpene extracted from these. So there we are. Friend of ours overconsumed. They're begging for help. Oh, what can I do? First question is, do you have any isolated CBD? Oh, maybe, maybe not. Second question might just very well be, do you have any whole black peppercorns? You want them whole because the terpenes are grown on the rind of it, so it's going to be on the outside of the little berry that is a black peppercorn. So grab the whole ones and usually say maybe between 5 and 10, throw them into your cheek and start sucking on them. You're really trying to use your saliva and your sort of digestion in the mouth to sublingually release the terpene, get it into your bloodstream. Don't chew on them. We're not talking like bubblegum effects kind of here. We're saying just suck on it, let it absorb in, and much like CBD, again, it can be helpful. I'm not saying it's going to kill the effect. It's not going to reverse anything, but we're trying to apply the brakes here to just make sure that person doesn't feel like it's too racy, too rampant, and too overwhelming. Now, the one thing is, again, pro tip, whole black peppercorn specifically, if you have multicolored, you're probably still going to at least help yourself out. Now, most people, you tell somebody to suck on black peppercorns, they immediately go, well, why am I going to do that? And aren't you sobering up rather quickly, my friend, questioning other behaviors? So that's one of the good ways conceptually to help them, as well as chemically. But if you run into one of these, some ground black pepper, do not try to take the ground black pepper challenge. It is not going to end up well. Now you got somebody who's too inebriated and choking. And that is going to be two states of discomfort that we do not want to promote at the same time. So once again, do not take the ground black peppercorn. That's going to create other issues at hand, although it still will be very distracting. You want to go with the whole peppercorn specifically because we're all trying to get some beta caryophyllene if possible. So these are going to be the sort of the household hacks to be able to help you if you overconsume. And that brings us to the last of our inquiries for the day, which is there any strategies we can use to be able to help ourselves out so that we don't run into this as often, so that we can avoid the decision that really tempts the risk? And so we actually have a method that we teach our bud tenders, and we'll let you get a little preview of it. It's called the LESS method. And it's a method to utilize when you're strategizing, changing things, or how to move forward. So the first letter is L, and that stands for low. Low means starting with a low dose. 2.5 milligrams is a starter for new people. 5 milligrams is a starter for people who may have been with it for a little while. But these are going to be ways to be able to understand where to begin so that hopefully you don't begin on a bad foot. Just remember, it can go 4 to 5 times the potency in the liver to that 11-hydroxy form that we talked about. So be careful. If you feel like you're sensitive, take even less. And a tincture is a good way to start because in a tincture you have a dropper. It's in these bottles. And so you can decide 5 milligrams, 2 milligrams, a little less. Just a little tipple might be all you need to get started. And we also have these in ratios of 1 to 1, 10 to 1, 5 to 1, so you can figure out exactly the potency you need. And the thing we like about tinctures, when you're starting with edibles especially, is you can figure out your dose, which is just enough to notice. You can figure out a dose which is enough relief to really feel well. You might figure out a dose which is also good for inebriation, and then the last dose you figure out might be the one that puts you down and puts you out when you need it. So that means you might have a couple different targets you want to hit depending on the time of day or how much you're suffering. The next one is establish. And we want to make sure that people take their time finding these doses, right? It might take a couple days, even a couple weeks to really let your body attune to this, give each sort of test of product the amount of time it requires to responsibly go through it and understand what it's going to do at 7 in the morning and at 7 at night. So this way, tinctures really do find a home, at least for edibles, but we have disposable vaporizers for the same reason, just smaller doses so you can take your time getting to the line of best fit. Then we're in the S's, right? L is for less, E is for established. The first S is for slow. And that is really the hardest thing for a lot of us. Be patient, not only in title, but in mind. Slow means waiting for the effects to onset. In a vape cart, it might be 3 to 15 minutes, but in an edible, it might be up to 3 hours, depending on your stomach. So you don't want to sit there in hour number 2 and saying, you know what, that brownie was so good, maybe I'll just take another bite. And there you are double dosing, and now it's starting to stack, right? It's starting to multiply on top of things, and then your liver comes into play. So this is why patience is a virtue. You don't want to jump the gun. You don't want to go both feet in at the same time. You want to be able to at least understand what's going on. And as we tell most folks, eating with food is ideal. If you're going to take edibles, put it with fats. Peanut butter, coconut oil, avocado, healthy things like that. And then lastly, after you've waited for the effects, you've established the baseline over time, you've taken low doses to start, supplemented is the very last step. And that means that once you have all your numbers figured out, you have your tried and true calculations down, you can now start to set up your dosing schedule. So that way you can tune your day. Maybe I don't need as much relief in the morning, maybe my issue's at night, and I can sort of create my curve through the day of where I want to be at what time. If I can start with a low edible dose, I can use vapes or flower to be able to get a couple of peaks in the day in case my effects need to be intensified or I require more relief. And maybe I'll use a topical even because they're not inebriating. The ones we sell at Terra Vita, they don't break into the bloodstream. And now I can relieve myself in a couple of different ways throughout the day to make sure I'm always on top of my condition and always in front of what I need to do. This way, if we use a full spectrum of products, we can heal from every angle. And this method can really help us maintain our curious explanation, the great part of the human condition, and hopefully avoid the very human mistake and pitfall that we're bound to run into from time to time. So some people might ask, can you have too much of a good thing? Well, in medical marijuana, the answer is absolutely yes. After such a beautiful and warm 420 this year, I'd bet that somebody, somewhere out there on the planet, may have celebrated a little aggressively, maybe took a little too much or something. It might have been from the wrong edible, might have been from a lot of flour, or even just a solid dab of something unfamiliar that can put us into that state of mind and feeling. So just keep ready. Some black peppercorns if you need. If you can find beta-caryophyllene and care like footing the bill, or just great CBD products can help. Keep that less method in mind. Low, established, supplemented, slow. That way you can always be pursuing it with a righteous objective. And I hope and wish you all good luck with it. Move forwards and enjoy the market. And thank you for tuning in. That's all I have for you today. That is our episode. So please like, share, and subscribe. If you cared for the material here, you can always send us your suggestions as well in the comments below in case you want to hear of any topic specifically, or maybe you had a situation or a product that made it very easy for you to overconsume. Put in the comments below. I'd love to hear about the couple of things you might have run into that were a little bit stronger than maybe you thought and maybe made you take a moment of pause. Or, hey, if you have a good recipe, I'm always game to figure out a new way to cook with it as well. But that's all I had for you today. So until next time, this is Scott from the Daily Dose Desk, hoping you can educate and medicate. Have a good one.